On the 19th of June 1940, 3 tugboats pulled an incomplete battleship out of a French shipyard with German troops visible on the horizon. Jean Bart had 1 working turret, half an engine, and a crew of shipyard workers who'd never sailed her before. Her first voyage would be her escape. Her second battle would come 2 years later when she fought the United States Navy from a harbor she couldn't leave. The mathematics of her construction were brutal. Jean Bart needed 8 15-inch guns in 2 turrets. She had 4 guns in 1 turret. She needed 9 6-inch secondary guns in 3 turrets. She had none. The barbettes sat empty, covered in concrete. She needed a full anti-aircraft battery. She had 3 37mm mounts and 6 13.2mm machine guns installed the day before departure without ammunition. At 3:30 on the 19th of June, tugs eased her into a channel dredged barely deep enough for her hull. The ship grounded immediately in darkness, bending a propeller blade. The tugs pulled her free. At 4:45, her engine started for the first time. 12 minutes later, 3 German Heinkel He-111 bombers appeared at 3,300 feet. 1 bomber scored a hit, a 220-pound bomb, between the main turrets. Insignificant damage. Jean Bart increased speed to 12 knots and rendezvoused with destroyers Le Hardy and Mameluke at 6:30. The British destroyer HMS Vanquisher met them at sea with 2 tugs, offering to tow Jean Bart to Britain. Captain Pierre-Jean Ronarc'h declined. His orders were Casablanca. The British withdrew. Jean Bart stopped 60 miles out to refuel from tanker Tarn. With no underway refueling gear and no experience, it took an hour to make connections. Pumping continued from noon to 1800 hours, 1,000 tons of fuel plus water. The battleship reached Casablanca at 1700 hours on 22nd June, the same day France signed the armistice. She was 77% complete. She would never get more complete in Casablanca. Within days, her anti-aircraft guns were stripped and moved ashore to defend the port. The 90mm and 37mm mounts went to jetties. 2 13.2mm guns went on trucks for mobile defense. Jean Bart sat in harbor with 4 15-inch guns and almost nothing else. On the 3rd of July 1940, Britain launched Operation Catapult, attacks on French warships to prevent German seizure. At Mers el-Kebir, 1,297 French sailors died when British battleships opened fire. At Dakar, torpedo bombers hit Richelieu. At Casablanca, Jean Bart waited. On 8th July, British torpedo boats attacked. Details are scarce. The attack caused damage, not catastrophic, but enough. Captain Ronarc'h ordered defensive measures. Open barbettes for the non-existent secondary turrets got covered with concrete. The incomplete super-firing turret, the empty space where a second quad 15-inch mount should have gone, was filled solid. Hull compartments were sealed. On August 11th, Jean Bart moved to shallow water. If she sank, she'd settle on the bottom with her turret still able to fire. Work continued through 1941 and 1942. On 7 September 1940, 16 13.2mm guns and 17 8mm machine guns arrived. Only 1 8mm was actually installed. Light machine guns were useless against aircraft. In 1941, an improvised director was fabricated from a torpedo tube platform salvaged from the old destroyer on Seine-Gabolde, providing a 46-foot rangefinder. In October 1942, search radar was fitted. By November 1942, Jean Bart had 1 operational quad 15-inch turret, a handful of anti-aircraft guns, radar, a makeshift director, and a crew that had trained her turret to fight even though the ship couldn't move. On the 8th of November 1942, Operation Torch began. Allied landings in French North Africa. An American task force approached Casablanca. Battleship USS Massachusetts, 9 16-inch guns, carriers Ranger and Sewanee, 3 heavy cruisers, and escorts covering 35,000 troops. French forces in Morocco numbered 1 light cruiser Primogüe, 9 destroyers, 11 submarines, the El Hank Coastal Battery, 4 7.6-inch and 4 5.4-inch guns, and Jean Bart, deployed as a floating battery. At 0700 hours, a French reconnaissance aircraft detected the American fleet. At 0704 hours, Massachusetts opened fire on Casablanca from 24,000 yards. The first shells hit Jean Bart's dock area. The battleship's crew went to action stations, her single turret trained toward the American ships. Jean Bart fired her first salvo at 0708 hours. 4 15-inch shells arced toward Massachusetts at a range she had never test-fired. The battleship had no proper fire control. The improvised director and rangefinder were designed for a complete ship with full systems. Jean Bart's crew was using equipment meant to work with systems that didn't exist. The first salvo fell short. The second straddled. Massachusetts maneuvered. Massachusetts replied with 16-inch fire. Her shells were fitted with fuses manufactured a generation earlier. Many failed to detonate. The ones that did exploded with devastating effect. At 0720 hours, a 16-inch shell struck Jean Bart amidships, penetrating the upper armored deck into an empty 6-inch magazine. The magazine had never been installed. The barbette sat vacant. The shell exploded in an empty space, causing minimal damage. Jean Bart continued firing. At 0735 hours, another Massachusetts shell struck the forward turret. This one didn't explode. The 2,700-pound projectile smashed into the turret's rotating mechanism and jammed it in train. The turret could no longer traverse. Jean Bart's only guns were locked, pointing at empty ocean. The battleship went silent. Massachusetts and heavy cruisers Tuscaloosa and Wichita continued bombarding Casablanca. American troops landed at Fadala, north of the city. French destroyers sorted to attack the invasion fleet and were driven back by cruiser fire. At 0800 hours, Massachusetts ceased fire on Jean Bart and shifted to other targets. Below decks in Jean Bart, damage control teams worked on the jammed turret. Twisted steel had to be cut away. Hydraulic lines had to be bypassed. The crew worked while American shells fell on the port around them. At 1724 hours, 9 hours after being hit, Jean Bart's turret was back in operation. On 10th November, American ships returned. USS Augusta and destroyers closed Casablanca to engage small French vessels attempting to rescue survivors from the destroyer Fougueux. At 1146 hours, Jean Bart's turret tracked Augusta. The battleship fired. The first salvo straddled Augusta at 19,500 yards. 2 shells short, 2 over. The American cruiser turned to sea immediately, increasing speed to get out of range. Jean Bart fired 9 more 2-gun salvos, chasing Augusta out to 29,000 yards. The last 3 salvos straddled the cruiser. USS Ranger responded. 9 SBD Dauntless dive bombers armed with 1,000-pound bombs and 8 F-4F Wildcat fighters launched at 1500 hours. The Wildcats strafed Jean Bart's anti-aircraft positions. The Dauntlesses dove from 7,000 feet. 2 1,000-pound bombs struck the battleship's deck, cratering the armor and penetrating below. One exploded in the forward engine room. The other detonated in auxiliary spaces. Jean Bart settled into the harbour mud, decks awash. She was sunk in shallow water exactly as planned when she'd moved to her berth in August 1940. Casablanca surrendered on the 11th of November 1942. Jean Bart had fired her 4 15-inch guns in 2 separate engagements against a fleet she couldn't pursue and ships she couldn't sink. She'd straddled a heavy cruiser with her last operational salvo before American dive bombers put her on the bottom. The strategic mathematics were clear. Jean Bart had cost millions to build and would have taken millions more to complete. USS Massachusetts cost $77 million and was fully operational. The American battleship fired approximately 780 16-inch shells during the three-day battle. Jean Bart fired perhaps 20 15-inch shells total across two engagements, but the incomplete French battleship had forced Massachusetts to maneuver. She'd driven Augusta out of range. She'd required dedicated airstrikes to neutralize. Every shell Massachusetts fired at Jean Bart was a shell not fired at French destroyers or shore positions or troops. The Germans never got her. The British never had to sink her. The Americans put her in the mud with dive bombers. After Casablanca fell, discussion began about completing Jean Bart. On the 15th of April 1943, Admiral Raymond Fenard reported to U.S. Vice Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Frederick Horn on the ship's status. Horn replied the 1st of May that she couldn't be completed to original specifications. The U.S. Navy agreed to tow her to America by September 1943, but only for repairs to steering. The Free French proposed two completion variants. Both involved replacing her 15-inch guns with 13.4-inch guns salvaged from old battleship Lorraine. Jean Bart's guns were needed for Richelieu. One variant included a quarterdeck modified for two catapults capable of launching TBF Avengers or Fairy Barracudas plus F-6F Hellcats or Supermarine Seafires. Total complement, 6 aircraft. In place of the second main turret and the missing secondary turrets, she'd receive 35-inch dual-purpose guns in 15 twin mounts, 64 40mm Bofors in quad mounts, and 50 20mm Oerlikons. None of it happened. Jean Bart sat in Casablanca through the war. In February 1945, she was towed back to France. Public opinion demanded completion. In 1949, she was finally finished, not to her 1940 design, but as an anti-aircraft battleship with updated systems. She entered service on the 16th of January 1949 and began sailing operations the 1st of May 1955. She participated in the 1956 Suez Crisis but saw no combat. Put in reserve 1957, decommissioned 1961, scrapped 1969. The incomplete battleship that escaped Saint-Nazaire hours ahead of German troops. That survived a British torpedo attack in July 1940, that fought USS Massachusetts in November 1942 with 4 guns and a jammed turret. That required American dive bombers to silence. Sometimes the best weapon is the incomplete weapon that exists. Jean Bart proved that an immobile battleship with 1 turret could tie up American heavy units, force airstrikes, and complicate amphibious operations. She never sailed into battle. She fought from the one place she could fight from, a harbor she couldn't leave with guns that barely worked, against ships that could maneuver and aircraft she couldn't shoot down. She fired perhaps 20 shells across 2 battles and changed exactly nothing about the war's outcome. But for those 14 minutes on the 8th of November 1942, and those brief minutes on the 10th of November when she chased Augusta out to 29,000 yards, Jean Bart was exactly what France needed her to be, a battleship that made the Allies work for Casablanca. That's all an incomplete ship could ever accomplish. And under the circumstances, that was everything.